Welcome, everyone. I see that people are coming in. We'll give them 2 minutes to join, and then we'll start. Okay, see people are still coming in. 2 more minutes. Okay. So welcome, everybody. My name is Shaqued Morag, and I am the Europe representative of the platform, which is quite a new coalition of 12 Israeli human rights organizations gathered together for joint international advocacy work. And today I'm hosting in this webinar 2 dear colleagues, Tania, Hary, the executive director of Gisha, the Center of the Right to Movement. I hope I said it well. And Shalev, the director of Physicians for Human Rights Israel, who will share from their perspective of how it is like to be Israeli civil society organizations fighting for humanitarian situation in Gaza during the last 6 months of war. I want to tell you, dear participants, that this webinar is being recorded and hopefully will be published later on our website. And we are going to have an hour together, starting with some introductions and questions that I will ask the participants, and then I'll move to questions that you raise. So you're more than welcome to use the Q&A button and put your own questions there. Hopefully we'll be able to answer as many as possible. Thank you again for joining, and I think we'll start. We'll start by asking our participants to briefly tell us about first, what does the organization you manage stand for, and what the activity looks like, and especially how the activity has been looking like since October 7th. Guy, we will start with you.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I don't think any of us imagined that we'll still be talking about this 6 months since October 7th. So I hope we'll be able to stop it as soon as possible. I'm the director of Physicians for Human Rights Israel, as Shaqued said, and we are an organization that advocates for the right to health of everyone between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, meaning Israeli citizens and residents, asylum seekers and statusless people, prisoners and detainees, and Palestinians under the Israeli occupation in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. We do so by providing humanitarian aid, direct humanitarian aid, both in our open clinic in Jaffa to statusless people and in our mobile clinics, both in the West Bank, that we now go twice a week to different communities in the West Bank and provide healthcare, and delegations going into Gaza. I should say in past tense, went into Gaza. We had more than 100 delegations in the past 14 years that we focused on capacity building, training of surgeons and healthcare professionals and mental health professionals with a lot of equipment and donations that we got in. It's unfortunate that a lot of that is now under the rubble. And since October 7, it was clear to us that we need to address the immediate human rights violation that we see, that most urgent were Israeli victims of the Hamas attack of October 7 and the evacuees of the Gaza envelope. So we sent our mobile clinic there to provide healthcare because they were evacuated to the Dead Sea where they were safe, but the state didn't provide any healthcare. So we were the first to be there with the evacuees of Kibbutz Be'eri, with our medical professionals to provide assistance. The other group that we immediately realized that they are under threat and their rights are being violated are the hostages. So we've been doing all we could in order to get medications to the hostages. We immediately from the first minute we got phone calls from hostages' families telling us that their family members need medications, and we contacted all our contacts in Gaza, hospital directors, administrators, with those lists, hoping that medications will be forwarded to the hostages, probably with no success. And of course, we immediately realized that there's going to be a very aggressive, illegal attack by Israel on the residents of Gaza. So we called for to stop the attack from the very first week, and ever since then, we are working very hard to advocate for ceasefire, to document violations of human rights, and specifically the attacks on the Gazan healthcare system and healthcare facilities. And also, alongside this attack on Gaza, we see very direct violations of the human rights of prisoners and detainees in Israeli prisons, both from Gaza, the West Bank, and administrative detentions of Palestinians, and violations of the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank with the settler's violence, military blockades of roads, stopping and basically not allowing Palestinians to get access, any access to medications and healthcare that they need. That's just a short introduction. I'll let Tania introduce herself.
Sure.
Thank you, Guy. Yeah, Tania from Gisha.
Okay. So Gisha means access and approach in Hebrew, and we've been focusing for 19 years almost of our existence on movement and access, especially to Gaza, founded just after the disengagement. And the idea was really to look at what Israel's responsibilities and involvement would be in Gaza in light of the disengagement. Of course, our perspective is that it never really disengaged, it simply reconfigured its control. And over the years, we were providing legal assistance to individuals to navigate the permit regime, to cross into and out of Gaza, to move goods, and looking more broadly at access policy, applying research and public advocacy as well to try to change policy. So we found ourselves, of course, after October 7th, I think, as shell-shocked and traumatized in many ways as many other people here in the region. And also in another way, like everything we had ever done had prepared us for this moment. We're the only Israeli organization focused on Gaza, on the situation in Gaza. So we have been serving as a resource, I hope, for journalists, for diplomats, for people who are interested in understanding the situation more broadly. And while a lot of our sort of day-to-day legal assistance, the fighting for permits that we had been doing before has sort of changed because of the near hermetic closure of Gaza. We've sort of reconfigured some of the way that assistance looks, so we still are providing individual assistance, and I can give some examples later on. And I would say really the main focus and thrust of our work has been very, very intensive legal and public advocacy on the issue of humanitarian access to the Strip, within the Strip, generally also looking at Israel's policy towards Gaza, the fact that it cut electricity, it cut water, it laid a siege, etc. So that's the intensive work that we've been doing since October 7th. And yeah, still quite relentlessly fielding a lot of requests for information and calls, comments, etc. on the situation.
So maybe to focus a bit more, there are many players working to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza internationally, from different governments and civil society worldwide. What is the leverage of Israeli organizations? What can you do that others can't? Tania, maybe we'll start with you.
I think a fair question would be what we can and what we can't do, because I think there is also a lot that we can't do. And part of what's happening now is also sort of trying to understand what our role is and what our added value is. I do think that one of the things that we're trying to do is serve also as a resource for information from within Israel. So publishing everything in Hebrew, making sure that information can get to people who are interested in it. In terms of what we can't do, it's very hard to convince people to care about the situation in Gaza from within Israel. So I think that those are some of the limits and trying to figure out how we can change that. I think also our access to the legal system is important. And here too, I would say, of course, there's a limit to that. There's a limit to what the legal system is willing to do. But I do see the courts as another kind of platform from which to sort of discuss these issues. So if you see the diplomatic arena and the media landscape as places where Israel's policy is being debated, for better or for worse, I think for us, we see the legal system also as an important arena. When we file petitions to the court, we're essentially challenging the state to explain its policies. And the courts, in most of the cases that we filed throughout the years, will either not intervene or take the position of the state, but it's still a kind of opportunity to get the discussion going, to get journalists to be interested. And so I think that as long as we have felt that that arena is still open to us and there is still a discourse to be had, that we have used it. But I do think that, there's also a limit, and the way that we're viewed in Israeli society limits, our reach in certain audiences in that sense. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts. Yeah.
Can you share with us a bit about this, the latest petition you filed, the ongoing one, in
Sure.
which I think there were some achievements also?
Yeah. Yeah, so we recently filed a petition, Gisha led it, but we were joined by Physicians for Human Rights, Adela, Akri, and Shaqued. And we were basically demanding that the court order the state to enable more access of aid to Gaza, particularly to the north of Gaza, to increase the volume of aid and also to provide for the needs of the civilian population under its occupation. And we had a hearing in that case last week, and basically the court was they asked us difficult questions, but they were responsive, and they have basically now put the onus on the state to explain how it will indeed increase aid and facilitation of aid within Gaza. Actually, by tomorrow, we're expecting a response by the state tomorrow afternoon. And they also have to give their response to the IPC report, the report that came out recently, noting that there is imminent famine in Gaza, and also to say how they're determining how much aid needs to go into Gaza. In other words, how they're monitoring the humanitarian situation. So those are important questions that the court is posing to the state. And I think that, hopefully they'll respond on time, they'll respond in full, but it'll be the first time that we get in writing from an official source, not tweets, not just the IDF spokesperson's comments, kind of a real document in writing about the way the state sees the situation, and also the commitments that it's willing to make right now to expand access. So I do see that as an interim victory, but at the same time, we really don't know where it'll go. I will also say that I think that we need to be aware that this process and the court petition itself isn't co-opted by the courts or by the state to sort of try to show the world that they're doing something, that there is, domestic remedy to sort of avoid scrutiny by international courts. So I think that we need to kind of keep our eyes wide open about this and, not just sort of settle for what's written down or what's in writing or the statements that are being made, and really look at how things are on the ground and whether these commitments are implemented. And I would say there, I'm a little bit less optimistic, but I'm glad at least that we'll have things in writing, and I would encourage people to follow and to hold Israel to account for what it says.
Thank you. Guy, would you like to reflect on this from Physicians for Human Rights perspective, being an Israeli-based, an Israeli organization, how it's like?
Yeah, so if I'm just continuing where Tania stopped, this also makes putting things in writing and having Israel having to respond officially to our claims as human rights community is very important also in terms of accountability. And I can give a few examples. For example, now when the Israeli military raided Shifa hospital for 2 weeks, and we got our people inside and told us that they don't have food and medications and water. So we sent a letter to the military, to the security apparatus, demanding that they respond and basically provide these needs to the people that are besieged in the hospital. We got the response from the security apparatus, and it was later found out that it was not correct, to say the least. So this is also important in terms of getting the official response and then corroborating what Israel is arguing and claiming in front of international bodies, and then make sure that on the ground there's some evidence to what they're claiming. And that would be very important, we think, when we demand accountability for the Israeli crimes that we see now in Gaza. Another aspect is the direct contact with our colleagues in Gaza, because we've been in close relationship with doctors and hospital directors for the past years, many years. So I can give another example. On October 22nd, I think, we just got a phone call from the director of Quds Hospital saying that he just got a call from the military demanding that he evacuate the hospital or they will be bombed. So, and then we filed a quick petition to the High Court to try to stop this attack on the hospital. So this kind of direct relation that can also be used in order to challenge the Israeli actions through the Israeli mechanisms can in sometimes change the course of action. Unfortunately, we know later that all these hospitals were attacked and raided and evacuated. So in hindsight, maybe we just bought more time. Another aspect is that we have more than 3,000 people that are members of our organization. Most of them are members of the medical community. So we try to use this kind of connection and mobilize this community in order to try to stop adverse peace from happening. One example is that there is an Israeli incarceration facility in the south called Sde Teiman, where all Gazan detainees are held as illegal combatants, but basically allowing no rights for them, no visitation of lawyers, and basic medical needs are not met. So the fact that we work with our medical community, we managed to get a lot of information from whistleblowers, doctors from civilian hospitals around the facility to which some of the detainees are being evacuated, or from even doctors from within the medical facility in this facility. And now we are going to publish a week from now a report on the violations of medical ethics that happen within these facility walls. So I think these are kind of the ways in which we consider ourselves as contributing to this kind of global effort of human rights organizations to try to mediate and stop crimes that we see on the ground. One other important, I think, aspect of us as human rights organizations based in Israel, and I think Tania is doing it very well in Gisha, and we're trying to do that as much as we can, is also speak to the international community in an atmosphere where every criticism of Israel is considered anti-Semitism, and I speak as a Jewish Israeli based in Israel who is also affected by the events, and we feel like this is an important voice that comes out and allows a critical discussion of the Israeli actions during these days.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that also covered my next question, and I'll take this time to remind our participants that you can also write down your own questions in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, and I can see them and raise them for you later on. I'll continue to maybe ask to elaborate a bit more about the current situation in Gaza. You referred to this a bit when you talked about it before, but Tania, maybe you can try to share with us how are you foreseeing the implications of the IDF forces withdrawing from the Gaza Strip in terms of access and humanitarian assistance? What is the desired situation? What are the concerns?
So I think we're in a tense and interesting moment. And of course, none of us know exactly what's going to happen, but it's clear that Israel is finally feeling some pressure about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I want to believe that partly comes from our petition. I think probably more likely is Biden and the US and also, you know, European allies are becoming more and more vocal and applying different forms of pressure to get Israel to sort of, you know, meet the most minimal of its obligations and alleviate the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And so we are seeing this scramble, again, at least rhetorically in the last weeks, you know, Israel trying to say it's doing all it can, it's increasing the truckloads, it's going to open more. It also gave a list of commitments already to the UN, and we expect, like I said, tomorrow a response to our petition where we assume they'll give a similar list of measures that they're willing to take. And I would just say, as a small aside on the question, I think that the fact of these sort of measures that have been announced or that are imminent, to me also proves what we've been saying for months, which is Israel is definitely not doing all it can to enable access, and even on the contrary, that it could have been using starvation as a weapon of war, and maybe even, you know, other forms also of withholding humanitarian assistance. So I think that in this coming period, again, we'll need to sort of monitor the situation and see. I think the fact of Israel pulling its forces from Khan Yunis can't alone be an indicator that things will improve. I think we will still need to see deconfliction mechanisms working and put into place. We need to see, you know, better and faster screening of goods at the crossings. What we've said basically is that without a ceasefire, we still don't see a way that the humanitarian situation could even begin to be addressed. And short of that, without a real kind of revolution in the way that Israel has been doing deconfliction work vis-a-vis the international community, we're not going to see a real change. The international organizations have been saying for 6 months that the biggest obstacle to delivery of assistance is lack of safety. After that, there are a lot of other hurdles and obstacles that we've been talking about, but safety is really the #1 issue. And of course, we saw that in a very extreme way with the recent killing of the WCK workers. But I think that is the real key here is what happens in terms of that deconfliction going forward. And again, I think that, you know, Israel has up until now used access of aid as a form of leverage and pressure. And unless there's an agreement, I don't really see that there will be a significant change in that. I think that even if we do see some improvements, we're still talking about Israel managing the situation and not a real change in approach of actually fulfilling its obligations to the civilian population. Even in the framework of our petition, and that's the last thing I'll say, you know, we very much wanted to have a discussion about Israel's obligations as an occupying power right now. And neither the state nor the court want to even get into those questions. They're only talking about the law of armed conflict and the most minimal duties to facilitate access. But let's say if there are not enough organizations that are willing or can provide aid, if, for example, UNRWA is still prevented from providing aid, we are saying that Israel actually has an obligation to provide the aid itself. And so we're still not seeing Israel take that step further and really acknowledge its obligation. So without that, I'm afraid we won't see a real change, but I hope I'm wrong.
So I'll take your last sentence forward to Guy. What role do you think the international community can play in putting pressure on Israel or any other assistance it can provide for solving this situation, both in short term and for the future? You should unmute yourself, Guy.
Sorry. So the first thing, as Tania said, is calling for an immediate stop of the hostilities, immediate ceasefire. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I thought I froze. So that's the first thing, and that should come from everywhere, including limitations of aggressive military support for Israel. So this is kind of the first immediate thing that the international community should do, is that pressure Israel to stop the attack on Gaza as soon as possible, including the release of the hostages and ending the hostilities right now. But also when we look at, for example, from our perspective on health, we acknowledge that the kind of excess mobility and mortality is something that we're still going to stay even once a ceasefire is achieved. So we need to think of short-term and long-term steps in order to protect the lives of the people in Gaza. And that means healthcare, but also social determinants of health. It means housing and education and physical safety of the people in Gaza. And we also should acknowledge that health cannot be achieved without sovereignty and dignity. So we're calling for immediate and long-term steps that will first lift the restrictions and resume the operations of the entire Gaza healthcare system and all WASH services, including the free movement of individuals who need immediate medical care, the protection and safeguarding of medical facilities, of course, rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian aid, allowing IDPs for dignified housing, temporary housing, first step, and then allowing the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip and providing housing for everyone, and of course the psychosocial support that is much needed these days. And in the long term, we call for the reconstruction of the Gazan society, and especially the Gazan, from our perspective, the Gazan healthcare system, and that involves Palestinians in Gaza. They should lead these efforts to rebuild, to design the rebuilding of the healthcare system. It should be focused on capacity building and resource development of the system in a way that's allowing for a system to be a stable and independent and unified medical system that's connected between Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as one healthcare system. And we need to call for accountability of the attacks on healthcare facilities and the Gazan civilian population. And basically, we need the international community to put a lot of pressure on political solution that protects the safety of everyone living in between the river and the sea, for collective rights and individual rights for everyone. This is the only way to get out of this immense pain and suffering.
Thank you. I'll just mention that we got at the same time 2 questions about that. One focuses more on EU member states and one more on international organizations. So if you have anything to add that is more focused than just international community, that's the chance.
I'll just add that, adding to my previous point, that we already know that there are some plans that are designed for the day after. And these plans are risky as far as we know, because they try to bypass Palestinian local society and social institutions. And we don't think that this is a good way forward. We need to empower the Gazan society in order to build itself with the support of international powers. And we need, I think, as international humanitarian and health community, to be very clear that we will not let this happen and will not let Palestinians in Gaza just remain as subjects of humanitarian aid forever. We need to build and rebuild local capacities.
Tania, do you have anything to add on that? The international community, both at the state level and the civil society level?
I mean, I know that the EU resents being seen as like the ATM, and the US is sort of the political force. But I invite the EU to be more of a political force. In the meantime, I think it's true that there is of course a lot of leverage that can be had with funding. So yeah, I mean, I would just say something that's coming to my mind is, we know that many countries have restored funding for UNRWA, but I think that is still something that's really important, is to kind of, maintain, increase the support for UNRWA and other organizations, anyone who is working on the ground, to improve the situation. And I think, yeah, coupled with that funding needs to be, like Gaia has already talked about very well, the calls for accountability. I mean, so that we don't see these cycles over and over again. I know that that's right now that is you know, the most sort of like, it can be seen as the most empty words possible, given we're just seeing like the most immense destruction that we could ever imagine. But I do think that, yeah, this should hopefully at least wake up the international community, as it's not been woken up in the past, to try to think of a fundamental way to shift the dynamics here. So yeah, I would welcome those suggestions also, you know, about where others might think that the EU could play a more active role, because I think, yeah, for us, I mean, I don't want to speak for Guy, but, you know, given that we're mostly based here in Israel, then it's hard for us to know at any given moment, yeah, where we can link up with what's happening at the EU level. That's why we have Shaqued, of course.
Thank you. Yes, I share a lot of what you describe, especially being the Israeli speaking on behalf of this humanitarian situation in Gaza. This is a voice that has its unique advantage, I'd say, in some international ears. So yes, that is absolutely something we try to make use of in order to fulfill our potential. And I would like you guys to address maybe the other side of being a civil society in Israel during war. What challenges have you been facing in the Israeli civil space and legal framework? Any changes since October 7th?
Yeah, so as I guess most of our listeners know, the Israeli society is enlisted to this war in a very considerable kind of portion of it. Most people, most Israelis, most Jewish Israelis support the war wholeheartedly. Some question maybe the leadership of Netanyahu. Some question the way that the government is dealing with the hostages crisis. But very few question the attack on Gaza and damage done to Gazan civilian population. So speaking up against this is not something very popular. I can say we all face kind of difficulties in our personal lives with our closest circles, families, friends who make this kind of communications very hard. Basically, we pose a threat to the national morale during a war, which is something that's not perceived positively, of course. But also, we're worried in terms of legal actions against us, narrowing our ways of get funding. There are some regulations that kind of make it hard for us to work. For example, from the very beginning of this crisis, we are trying to get humanitarian aid into Gaza to support the medical system that we know so well and in such good relations with. And we tried to get humanitarian aid through Israel. That, of course, was blocked. But then we tried to purchase aid outside and then get it into Rafah, but then the bank blocked our transaction and threatened to freeze our account. So there are also all kinds of regulations, and I would say civil society and also the private sector who are complicit in this starvation and siege on the Gaza Strip. And we also are worried from the day after, because we've been told, and we kind of worried that the day after we'll be seen as those who maybe failed the military operation of Gaza. We'll be seen as those who, because of us, the kind of ultimate victory that the government has promised is not being delivered, and we are worried.
Thank you. Tania, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't think so.
Okay, so before my final question, which will hopefully give you something positive to end this webinar with, I'll go to something a bit less positive. This is a question by Doreen van der Berg, who was wondering if you could speak, Guy, to the situation of the Gazan taken out of Gaza as detainees by Israel. Is this something you're working on? You are, so please tell us a bit.
Right, so there are, we published a report on the human rights violations in the Israeli incarceration system, and we're going to publish one more week from now. Shaqued can send over the links for those of you who want to read more about it. But basically, there are three main populations of Palestinians that are now held in Israeli incarceration facilities where the human rights are being violated. There are the Palestinian, like normal Palestinian population, were considered as security prisoners, and their rights have been limited. They were not able to see lawyers or access medical care, not within the facility and not, of course, outside the facility. So we've seen a lot of deterioration in the health of a lot of Palestinian prisoners, to the extent that 12 Palestinian prisoners have died in the Israeli prison service since October 7. We participated in autopsies of most of them, and we've seen evidence of medical neglect and sometimes even guard violence on these prisoners, which is a crisis by itself. Another population are Gazans who had working permit in Israel before October 7 and got their permit revoked overnight. They were just put in camps, again, in very bad conditions. Some of them were released later on, but others also got were kind of, their medical conditions got worse and with no proper access to healthcare. The third population, which is in worse conditions, like I mentioned before, are everyone who were arrested from Gaza, meaning those who took part in the October 7 attack, but also anyone who were arrested in Gaza by the Israeli forces once the raid started. And they are all defined as illegal combatants with very limited rights. They're held in Sde Teiman, an incarceration facility that the conditions there amount to torture, but by any sense. Just as a reference, one of those illegal combatants was an 82 Alzheimer patient that was arrested in Gaza. We tried to get her out for 2 months, just saying how this definition is being used liberally. Others are just released after some weeks that the military decided they're not part of any illegal terrorist activity. And as I said, we're going to issue another report about the medical care that these detainees are getting. They are held handcuffed for more than 20 hours a day. We have evidence of amputations that were caused by these conditions of being handcuffed so many long hours. When they are referred to Israeli civilian hospitals, they're not getting the treatment that they're supposed to get. There are actual regulations by the Israeli Ministry of Health that violate medical ethics. All of this is happening with no access to the ICRC to check on these prisoners and detainees. And as I said, you can read more, but this is by itself these by itself are crimes that needs to be Israel to be accountable for. I might add that at least 27 people died in Sde Teiman, in the incarceration facility for Gazans, and just as a comparison, only 9 people died in Guantanamo for many years of activity. So in just 5 months, we've seen this immense loss.
I want to just add that Gisha and also a few other organizations are also trying to trace the detainees that are being taken from Gaza and for months, we've not been given answers. Just yesterday, we got an answer to a request of ours on behalf of 3 individuals. Finally, the state admitting that it's holding 2 of the 3. 1 had been released a few days prior. And we spoke to him yesterday, and he's just absolutely destroyed psychologically, physically. He also described what Guy said, you know, being shackled so long and held in kind of positions, you know, on his knees, so much so that he has now permanent damage. And I think just, yeah, it really attests to how grave the situation is, and the fact that these families have no idea where their loved ones are, if they're still alive, if they're being held. And it's really a kind of cruelty. And of course, this person was held for 2 months and then released with nothing. And so just a real lack of accountability there for this situation. So yeah, it's really concerning, and I would encourage people also to follow this and yeah, not let it kind of get lost in everything else that's happening.
Thank you. There is another question from our participant, Wood, was asking, are you asked a lot for interviews in Israeli media? And are your views welcome there? So that's a complicated question. Who would like to start?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay. The short answer is no. Overall, the media is not interested to know what we have to say. And here we are sitting, Tania and I, and the 2 organizations that have the most expertise in Gaza and the most experience in what's actually happening in Gaza, and the facilities that are in place, and any aspect of like their lives there, but still on TV studios, they'll have, I don't know, dozen of interpreters and military officials who will, of course, tell a very different story than the one that we know is the reality. This is part of the Israeli campaign on Gaza, and that is keeping Israelis in the dark, not knowing what's being done in their name. We were invited to one Channel 12 studio after more than 4 months since the war started. And then our chairperson of the board, a doctor who has been to Gaza a few times in our delegations, someone that definitely they should listen to and see and get her perspective. But she was just silenced, and then she was on Zoom. Then she was just taken off the air while she was speaking. So this, I think, shows a lot about the way that the media is conveying the reality in Gaza to the Israeli public. I mean, we should also note that Haaretz is doing relatively good work, and as maybe the only Israeli media that reflects some of the atrocities in Gaza.
Tania, do you get interviewed a lot?
We've gotten a few requests in the past week regarding our petition. It's mainly radio, interestingly enough. But yeah, I do think that what Guy is talking about, even when we do get requests sometimes for media interviews, we have to ask ourselves what we can gain from them, because a lot of the time it can be a quite hostile environment, and you might think from the outside that it's always good to have a platform, but actually I think in some cases it can be more damaging than beneficial. So I do think we have to ask ourselves, and I agree very much with Guy that Haaretz is doing a great job. Sicha Mekomit, 972 magazine, there's also some other media outlets that are doing good work, but overall there's really been quite a stark media blackout. Very, very few human stories from Gaza. I think we're just starting to see it on the mainstream news TV channels, that you're seeing some more images from Gaza, you're seeing some more interviews with people. But you know, yeah, up until now, it's really been just completely focused on what's happening inside of Israel. And I keep saying it's like Israelis are reliving the trauma of October 7th just over and over again on the nightly news. It's just story after story of people who were affected, which is of course important, but it's not the whole picture. And so I think that that's really detrimental to people's understanding of the situation. I have to say, though, I'm not sure that if there were more information that would necessarily translate to more empathy. So really also a problem of empathy at this moment.
Yes, and just adding that there was this law passed against Al Jazeera, so there are actual legislative efforts to stop from the information coming in.
Yes, freedom of speech in Israel is certainly under threat from many directions, both terms of willingness of the media channels to deal with the issues and the political attempts to narrow the space for opposition to speak out or for human rights defenders. And I'd like, first, we are in our last minutes of the webinar, so if there are any participants who have questions, that's your last chance to add them. And thank you for those who already asked. And my question, I want to end with some hope, maybe, if you can share with us some of your success stories during these last 6 months. Tania, can you start?
Okay, yeah, I like the idea of trying to end with hope, though it's a difficult moment for that. So I would say one thing that we've been proud of is work that we've done together with our partner Shaqued, evacuating Palestinian citizens of Israel, actually, who make a home in Gaza. So, you know, prior to October 7th, there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel who live in Gaza. When you have a couple that is you know, as we say, mixed, somebody with a Palestinian ID and somebody with an Israeli citizenship, they're not allowed to live as a family inside of Israel. So their only option is to live in Gaza. And so you have couples and their children who are eligible for Israeli citizenship who live inside of Gaza. And in the past, some of these people would come in and out for various reasons. After October 7th, a lot of these people started turning to us once Israel started allowing foreign citizens out of Gaza, and they turned to us for assistance in evacuation. And at first, Israel was quite reticent to allow these people out. We worked really quite hard negotiating with COGAT. Eventually, we were forced to file petitions to the courts. And there was one justice who pressed the state to say, how are these are Israeli citizens. How are they any different from, let's say, an Israeli citizen who was trying to flee the Ukraine? And this put some pressure on the state to, you know, say why it was treating these citizens different than it would anyone else. And so since then, we've now had 3 convoys of citizens come out in a very complicated procedure, exiting via Rafah, going through the entire Sinai, coming back in through Eilat. They've been forced, though, through very difficult interrogations. Many of them had to prove that their children were their children. So if the children weren't registered already, they had to pay for very expensive genetic testing. So it's been a very complicated legal process, but I do think that at the end of the day, we're glad that we were able to you know, press them to do, again, the most minimal of their duty, which is to evacuate their own citizens. If other countries can do it, Israel should have to do it. And I should say that there is another 4th convoy, and we're seeing Israel dragging its feet on this, and we don't understand exactly what the problem is. So we're still working on evacuating more people. And we would also like to try to evacuate people with children who are not necessarily eligible for Israeli citizenship. this is something that Israel has not yet agreed to, so the children of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian ID holders only, so that's a frontier I hope that we'll get to. But in the meantime, more than 100 people have been able to enter Israel and are now, you know, in relative safety because of that.
That's very, very good to hear. Thank you. Guy, can you also share with us something that can inspire some hope?
Yeah, so like Tania said, unfortunately, these are not moments of a lot of hope. And I said earlier how hard it is to get Israeli communities mobilized against the attacks on Gaza. And I would say maybe particularly the medical community has been, as a community, kind of a source of disappointment in a great support of the attack, and to the extent that dozens of Israeli doctors signed a letter urging the military to bomb Gazan hospitals. But then we saw one moment of light 2 or 3 weeks ago when Gazan patients that got permits to get medical treatments in East Jerusalem and in Israel before October 7 got a notice from the military that they have 24 hours to be deported back to Gaza. Just as one of them is a 48-year-old cancer patient who will be deported to Gaza, but then somehow needs to go back for treatment 2 months after. Of course, that wouldn't be possible. And healthcare that person will get in Gaza will not allow him to survive. A 9-year-old girl who donated bone marrow to her brother. So the brother and the mother will stay, but the girl will be deported back to Gaza, where her father was killed. So this is really a cruel decision by the Israeli military to deport these people. And then we saw we saw the medical community mobilized. They called us, they contacted us, they requested that we try to stop this decision. Doctors in Sheba Hospital in the center of Israel stood in the entrance to the hospital and said they'll not let anyone take their patients back to Gaza. The taxi was already on the way to take the patients, and we just said that we're not going to let them get on the taxi. And we filed an urgent petition to the High Court together with other organizations, including Gisha, and we managed to stop this deportation, at least for 30 days. We are waiting to see what will happen in 10 days from now. So it showed us that maybe there's a crack, because when they see a name and a patient that they actually cared for, then they couldn't even imagine sending that person back to Gaza. So the kind of unnamed 14,000 kids, so 33,000 Gazans are just kind of, they get no empathy. But then if you have a person that you know with a name, with the medical record, then it feels just impossible to send that person to die in Gaza. So maybe that's a moment that we hope will help kind of open the hearts of people in Israel, and particularly the medical community, in trying to resist the continuing attack on Gaza.
Thank you for that. We really need those tracks for the light to come in. And that's it. Our hour has come to its end. I share what you opened with, Guy, the frustration of us even being here at this time, concluding but not concluding yet half a year of war. This shouldn't be the situation, and we must and will continue to do all we can in order for this to end soon. And we have still lots of work to be done on the day after, but for that we also really need to bring that day as soon as possible. And I want to thank you, dear partners who joined us today, for your support and for your efforts, and hope again the next webinar can be a day after webinar. And as you said, Guy, I will send to all the participants the updates, both about the petition and the detainees reports. Thank you again for participating, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Thank you, Guy and Tania.
Thank you all. Thank you, Shaqued.
Bye-bye.